So I want to thank Bob, a colleague and an esteemed author of a great book. If you haven't read it, you should. And also thank you all for being here, as well as the other speakers. Quite a lineup of speakers. It's really impressive. And I'm going to try and build off of the themes that they have presented so far today. What is it? Oh, I see. I don't know what I'm doing. So my husband and I worked and lived in 5 different continents. We lived on the East Coast, we lived on the West Coast, we lived in between, and we had to make a decision. Where were we going to settle down? And we had several job opportunities. One of them was in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and others were in other areas. And so he got together this little sheet, and he created columns. And he said, okay, so, and I really wanted the job in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And he said, now tell me, what is your number one criteria? What's your number one reason that you would want to live there? And I said, well, it's obvious, because all of the carnivores and ungulates that have been in that system for a long time are still there. And he just looked at me stunned and slowly ripped up the paper. And he said, if that's your criteria, we're done. So Yellowstone is my backyard, it's my refuge, it's where I get my energy and my vision. And parks are really important to me in wild areas, but also the wildlife in them. I'm not going to talk about what made me feel that way about wildlife, but I do want to pose to you all, what is it that we need to do as a society to make sure that more people are like me and that appreciate that and cherish it? But what I'm really going to talk about today, I will touch on that again, but I'm going to talk about science. And I'm going to tell a little story about pronghorn, and pronghorn specifically in Wyoming. You know, I think there are more pronghorn than there are people in Wyoming. And yet there's a population of pronghorn that almost went extinct in Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. Is it okay for a species to go extinct in a park when it's not endangered elsewhere? Probably not, right? So what do you do? Well, in a collaboration with the National Park Service, Joel Berger, who was actually mentioned by Gary earlier, sat down and started to try and figure out why, and with a team of scientists, began to try and figure out a picture. So one of the first things he did was try to figure out whether or not there was recruitment, whether or not pronghorn who came to the park in the summer to give birth, whether their fawns were surviving. And in fact, at the beginning of the study, we very quickly figured out that without wolves, about 98% of those pronghorn fawns were eaten and dead in 2 weeks. Wow. As research goes, there's a lot of discovery that can happen, and we had actually collared these pronghorn. And what we inadvertently sort of were able to nail down was that pronghorn move in and out of that park in a very narrow pathway, that area that's hatched there. And it turns out that pronghorn, although the fastest land mammal in the United States, can't jump. So one fence would mean the extinction of a species from a park. And all the agency partners got really excited and interested in this because it's sort of an obvious issue. And in fact, Beringia Teton National Forest created the first ever federally designated wildlife corridor. And Grand Teton National Park, the refuge system, also committed to conservation of this really unique phenomena of migration, and the BLM created ACECs to protect their pieces. That's a cool success. But as conservation goes, it's always incremental, and the story's not over. So look right here is Highway 191, and this is what it looked like from a pronghorn perspective. Not easy to get across, and in fact, the town of Pinedale, which is right adjacent to that area, has increasing amounts of traffic. It's an area of high natural resource extraction, dangerous for people, really bad for pronghorn. So the next step, and another really cool story, is that they created a series of wildlife overpasses and underpasses, and lo and behold, we didn't actually know. We were a little nervous, and we were looking at behavior before, during the construction, and after, and it worked. Really cool. I want you to continue to watch this conservation story because it's not actually over. Wolves were delisted. Park wolves are you can actually hunt park wolves if they step outside of the park. So what will that do for pronghorn in the long term? That first federally designated migration corridor, it's not permanent. It's in a management plan. Management plans are not binding. So we need to continue to work on it. Science is just part of a process toward moving towards conservation. All right, so I'm going to just step back really quick. I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society. For those of you who don't know who it is or what it is, it's a really old organization founded in 1895 out of the Bronx Zoo. We work in 70 countries around the world. Our goal is to conserve wildlife and the best last wild places. In the United States, we actually gave a piece of land to Grand Teton National Park, not quite as big as what the Rockefellers gave. We've worked collaboratively and are working collaboratively with the National Park Service on everything from lagoons to bison to wolverines, et cetera. All right, now let me just tell you the meat of my talk. So it's sort of hard when Gary's here to actually give comments on revisiting Leopold. I told him I was going to heckle him, but I lied. Actually, it's a really good document, and I'll tell you why. And also to talk about science and the role of science in natural resource management, particularly pertaining to parks. That's a huge topic. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of things. One, I'm going to talk about the state of conservation in the United States and how that pertains to national parks. I'm going to talk about what it really means to do conservation at scale and build on a theme that people have talked about earlier, and the context, again, of national parks in that area, and then offer some thoughts based on those issues as to what the National Park Service could do. Okay, so what's the state of conservation in this country? You've seen this map, it was shown earlier. These are protected areas of different levels, from everything from national parks and wilderness areas to multiple use lands. Over here is what I call the scattershot approach. This is what we call conservation easements. Cool thing about it, conservation easements are increasing. Here's the numbers. The bad news is that conservation easements, that term, I don't like it. A conservation easement could be to preserve agricultural row fields. It could be to create an open space between two cities. It could be, a conservation easement could be to preserve recreational opportunities, and sometimes it's for biodiversity. So although we're doing really well, just note that not all those lands are for biodiversity. They certainly can help, but there's some challenge there. More importantly, when you put these two pieces together, this is what we call our de facto conservation system. The United States is one of 3 countries in the world that has not signed onto the Convention of Biological Diversity. We do not have a national conservation plan. Okay, so there have been a lot of people who are pushing for national conservation plans. In fact, the first mention of it that we could find was started in 1917. I think earlier today somebody mentioned that landscape conservation cooperatives might be able to be stitched together to create a national conservation plan. These little beautiful colors are the 29 landscape conservation cooperatives that are run now by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's a new concept. It's thinking about working at scale, working outside of any particular national park, any particular jurisdiction, but to work at the scale the ecological processes operate, right? So this is one attempt that's moving forward. As someone asked, are they failing, are they moving? My hope as a landscape ecologist is that landscape ecology is out of the bag and that we're not going to go back to managing postage-sized stamp pieces of property in isolation of one another. Whether it's this or some other version of this, I'm not sure. Another version of sort of what some people thought might become the National Conservation Plan was done by states. This is just an example from the western states of what they call crucial habitat assessment tools. So even if I take the names, is that blurry to you all, or is... No, okay, good. This is blurry from the side. So even if I take the names off of the states, you can see the state lines. Why? Because they're not working from the concept of a national plan. They're each creating their own set of priorities, and so there's no edge matching here. So that's not really going to work as a national plan. Why do I care about this? Why is it important to have a national plan? And why would the National Park Service care about this? Well, the National Park Service is it literally, it was the best idea for conservation, right? And now we're moving into the 21st century, but how does the Park Service decide what it's going to do in the 21st century if it doesn't have the context of a national plan? They have to set their own priorities. The BLM has to set their own priorities. The Conservation Land Trust have to set their own priorities, and everybody's sort of guessing as to whether or not that's going to be, ultimately sum up to something that will conserve our biological heritage enduring forever. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about, so what's changed since Leopold's report? And I'll just go quickly because Gary did my work for me. But, obviously climate change is a big issue. We're not going to have the same species in the same places over time, and we have to be thinking about that. Another issue that was mentioned earlier, and Patty Goody didn't get to talk about her work on ex-urban development, which is sprawl in rural areas. But really, it's a big deal, right? So here is a park in the Bay Area that literally is adjacent to a huge urban area. What does that mean for that park, and how does that compromise the park? And over here, this is my favorite one from Idaho, the natural choice for home and habitat. For those of you who like irony, right here where the road is, this is the open space where habitat is going to continue to thrive. Yeah. And also since the Leopold report, science has really gone forward. I'm a landscape ecologist. That didn't exist back then, right? We literally have transformed the way that we look at large landscapes and the way that we're able to understand how animals move. We were able to put GPS collars on those pronghorn to figure out exactly where they went. Nobody knew exactly what the route of the path of the pronghorn was in and out of Grand Teton National Park until the research showed where they were going. Science can inspire. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. With Charlie Chester and Molly Cross, we looked at 19 large landscape and seascape studies from around the world. And while we were asking specifically what they were doing on climate change, what I want to pull out is some of the lessons that are pertinent to this particular topic. So the first thing is, there's discussions that around the world, believe it or not, in academic literature, that maybe we should have parks that are movable in space and time. And in fact, in some cases that might really work. In the terrestrial part of the United States, that probably won't work. Because it's not like you can take Yellowstone National Park and just move it a little further north and just tell everybody, including me and Bozeman, to move out of the way, right? And also, parks are really good core areas. But we know, and people have said this over and over again, but it's really important that parks are sufficient, are important, but they are not adequate in and of themselves. So what more do we have to do? Well, the next lesson that comes out of those 19 case studies is that doing conservation at scale is really important. And there are two pieces of that were emphasized that groups are really working on. And that's the expansion of core areas, right? Making sure that it's not just a national park in isolation, but perhaps creating an area that's big enough to sustain the ecological processes that might endure over time. And likewise, to make sure that we have a connected area network and allow the opportunity for species to move. This is sort of the saving the stage, if you will, and letting the players move or the species move, but creating adequate opportunity for that to happen in time and space. So an example I'll give is from somewhere far away here over in the Appalachians. And WCS and a number of other scientists have looked at human footprint, which is what this is, and connectivity and the impacts of climate change. For this map, the red areas are human impacted areas and the green are less human impacted. And we know right now today that there's some level of connectivity. For example, moose moved from here right into the Adirondack State Park. They had been extinct for a long time. So there's some level of connectivity. We ought to conserve that. And why should we conserve that? Well, there are species that might be moving, and birds aren't the best example, but this was a cool example to show just how these species are likely, right here, they're kind of dipping into the Appalachian region, but these are really boreal species. And we know from lots of science that's accumulating that species are moving north. And so as these kinds of species move north, we're losing them from that area. Now, some of you, if you've ever heard of a TEDx talk, look up Molly Cross's TEDx on why we should be positive about climate change. And here's one small tidbit from it, is that while those species are leaving, new species are coming in. Okay, so it's not all necessarily a loss. And so we really have to be prepared for that change and to define what that change means for us. Another really interesting thing that came out of those case studies is that we actually don't have adequate science. And I put the grizzly bears up there because they're a great example. In 2007, they were prepared for delisting, and oh geez, what's the impact of climate change going to be on one of their keystone foods, white bark pine? Okay, so we had to go back to the drawing table and do a few more years of research to really answer that question, to make sure that there was going to be a long-term viable population. The other, despite that there's not enough science, though, I think one of the interesting things about science is the ability to help create frameworks that can enable us to make management decisions even if we don't have the right information. And it's called scenario planning. So we might not know if it's going to get hotter and drier or hotter and wetter, but if those are two of the viable scenarios of the future, what's the most robust management decision we can make on a certain species or on a certain system? And we can still move forward with a management decision even if we don't have adequate information. Another lesson is that even the most remote areas are impacted both by people and by climate change. Our own research showed that nesting birds are nesting about 10 days earlier than they were 25 years ago. Wow. Okay, so what does that mean for us, and what does that mean for the national parks that are up there? Well, it means that we might have to think about things. We might have to think about things from that biological perspective, but also the human perspective. Here's, how ships move around the world, or did move around the world. But now that sea ice has melted, they're starting to go over the top. Why? Because it's shorter and cheaper. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that congregations of amazing species like bowhead whales are increasingly getting hit. There are solutions to this. In fact, working on shipping lanes, it turns out it's really important. Off the East Coast, they were able to move a shipping lane and reduce the collisions of boats and whales by about 85%. We got to get ahead of the curve here on even these remote places, or once remote places, and figure out what it means and come up with solutions. And some of that means figuring out where, I showed that picture of the Arctic, but actually the climate models suggest that over in Russia, it might actually change more slowly. Well, maybe we ought to think about protected areas in those places that will enable those species that might not adapt as quickly, and try and protect those areas. And like I said, we have to think about what humans are going to do during this time of climate change. My second to last lesson from these 19 case studies is that whether it's the parks or whether it's conservation writ large, the most important thing for communities is trying to find those win-win scenarios. And there are a lot of win-win scenarios out there, and reaching out beyond park boundaries and working them out together is going to be really important for doing conservation successfully in a transboundary large landscape fashion, because we're going to have to include community lands and private lands to be successful. So I'll just give one example from Sarah Reed's work. She was looking at what's called conservation development, and the Wall Street Journal says it pays to do conservation. Well, maybe. But this gets to Patty Goody's work, which is looking at the difference between sort of sprawling developments versus consolidated developments. And it turns out that in a lot of these, this isn't necessarily the greatest example of consolidated development, but in consolidated developments, actually they're worth more. And they also end up costing communities less in services over the long haul. We got to get this information out from science and out to the important areas of private lands. The last thing and the last lesson from those 19 case studies is, wow, it's really hard to do transboundary conservation when you don't have the top-down and the bottom-up levers. Both in the case of the Appalachians region and the Yellowstone to Yukon region, the governments aren't actually talking to each other. In the case of the Appalachians, there's a great staying connected effort. They're really trying hard to conserve the connectivity between the core areas. It stops right at the border because there's no money and no leverage behind it in Canada. That's a problem. One way to get past it is to look at something like what the European Union has in the Natura network, which is really one of the best examples of top-down, bottom-up, and really requiring cohesion across multiple countries. It's amazing, and it could be a lesson for us, not just across countries, but across states and across multiple jurisdictions. Okay, so this gets into the opinion part. Okay, so from the Revisiting Leopold document, they mentioned this coherent and sustainable national conservation, land and seascape. Well, in order for that to happen, I really think that we need to have a national vision and a national plan, and that's going to enable the National Park Service to play a very clear role moving forward in the future. The National Park Service can move forward without it, but where should it put its parks? What's really missing? Can it make those decisions in isolation of everything else that's happening? The second is on transformative experiences, education, and inspire. And this goes back to my own personal story of why I moved to Yellowstone. We know that there's nature deficit disorder. We know that there are problems. The National Park Service needs to take a role. I hope that the National Park Service finds a way to create contagion for a young generation of naturalists who go out and discover, whether it's in their backyard, whether it's big things or small things, and make it cool. Ecological integrity and connectivity. Those are a couple of words that came out from that Revisiting Leopold report. Those are really important. And the National Park Service already is. There are a number of great examples out there for all of the things that I've mentioned, but in particularly in this. But it would be great if every national park was doing this. If they were able to establish, and it was part of their mandate, that they actually had to have successful partnerships beyond boundaries, successful examples of science. The Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team is a great example from a science perspective of what happened in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Literally, if they hadn't created that, we would have had data from Wyoming, data from Montana, data from Idaho. None of it would have matched. It never would have made any sense. But instead, what they did was they created an incredible collaborative of all of the agencies in the region. That's success. We need more of that. Likewise, the tools that I talked about, whether it's conservation development or other tools that get out into those communities that help those communities benefit from the parks and want to allow those wildlife and those ecological processes to continue to exist not just in the parks but around the parks, is really important. Climate change is the 21st century issue, and the National Park Service is a leader, and it should be a leader in this issue. It should really help us define how to move forward. Agencies continue to struggle with it, and it is admittedly a very tough issue, but the National Park Service should be the science lead in figuring out how to make sure that we save our biological heritage forever. So it's a changing world. You know, when I was in graduate school, we were still talking about managing for a pre-Columbian or pre-Columbus sort of standard. Now literally there's been a paradigm shift. We're somewhere close to the end of it, but we're managing for an unknown future. And it's really clear no one's talking about pre-Columbus metrics anymore. And you know, from the landscape conservation cooperatives and many, many other examples, we're now actually the idea of doing conservation at a scale that ecological processes and that wildlife move at is really out of the bag. It's happening. So what do we need to do? We still need to develop new tools. We need to continue to push forward science. We need incentives for communities to engage, since we're talking about a lot of private lands as well as public lands. And we need some new policies. So I think that the Revisiting Leopold document is a really strong vision for the future, and I'm really pleased to hear that it's moving forward. I hope that the National Park Service will be part of a national conservation vision and plan, and will be a cornerstone for that plan. The National Park Service is sort of the core of so many large landscapes, and needs to really push conservation at scale if it's to conserve what it has inside any individual park or across the park system. And finally, the National Park Service can and should continue to be a leader in science, in education, and in research, both within their parks but beyond their boundaries, and including on climate change. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Due to climate change. We also see a decoupling temporally in terms of plant phenology, migration patterns, and pollinators. would you suggest that the National Park Service embraces the concept of assisted translocation of species in order to address these type of problems?
Very interesting question. So he asked whether the National Park Service should be really considering the issue of assisted migration. What was most interesting when we looked across When we, sorry, I wandered. When we looked across the 19 case studies of large landscape and seascape efforts, nobody had in their plans or even discussed the issue of assisted migration. What that is moving species that once ranged here and might now range here, and literally moving them to a new place. It's a very, very difficult issue, right? Because all of a sudden you're moving a species into a new place with a new cast of characters with unknown consequences. We humans, we've done this a lot, both on purpose and inadvertently, and there are lots of times there are inadvertent consequences. It might be a tool that we end up needing to use in the future. I think the evaluation of when and where and how to use that is still being done.
Could you say a little bit about this whole critique of new conservation that suggests that we're kind of going down the wrong path and setting aside land because it keeps failing to preserve biodiversity? So could you respond to that critique of the new conservationists that say that we're headed toward rambunctious gardens rather than real biodiversity?
Okay, thank you. Well, so there is a line, and I would call it a largely intellectual discussion about the level of human impact across the globe and whether there really are any baseline areas that are untouched by people, and whether we're really just looking across a gradient of different levels of human impact. And, to some degree, that's probably right. However, when you go to science meetings, there's huge discussion and bashing about what the particulars are around that. And some people are saying, for example, that the Nature Conservancy is moving away from protected area conservation. Well, I think that would be tragic, personally. I don't see that as happening. You don't see, well, we'll see. John Jarvis hasn't talked yet, but, I don't think that the National Park Service is about to disarticulate and invite cattle to come in the boundaries, and nor that that's a good idea. I think it's a healthy discussion to have about the levels of human impact that are actually affecting our parks. How pristine is any park? You can go to the far north and test, take blood samples from Alaska natives, and they have all the same carcinogens in them that we have here. It's a global world.
The concepts of revisiting Leopold and the National Conservation Plan concept are phenomenal and fantastic. But how is the process of putting these effectively in front of the American people going forward? Because we can talk about the science, we can talk about all of the things that go in there, but without effective support across the board, I think there are difficulties ahead.
Absolutely there are, and I'm not a social scientist, although I occasionally dive into that literature. And so I can say that, there is, the majority of the country really supports the National Park Service, and we'll hear from John later, but as to how he's going to implement that, I think a different issue is how and whether the United States and its constituency would be willing to actually consider a national conservation vision and what a plan would look like. It would probably take something like an executive order to even begin to do the research necessary, both on the social side of things as well as the biological side of things, to figure out how to make that happen.
Who paid for the bridges for the antelope?
Great question. So the question was, who paid for those bridges for the antelope? And the Department of Transportation. That was some federal dollars and some state dollars paid for that. Some state dollars? Uh-huh. Yeah, so there's state departments of transportation and there's a federal department. And so it was a mixture. That was a pretty unique case. I mean, I think a lot of times with underpasses and overpasses that happen for wildlife, they happen actually because of human safety issues, not because of wildlife issues. The reason, at least that I hypothesize that these went in, is because of the immense amount of attention that the path of the pronghorn got across, and the massive levels of support. Gretchen Long is sitting behind you. She's from Jackson, and she can talk about how energized that community gets around that pronghorn population. It's really neat. Thank you.